Real Hi-Fi Help with part 3 of this masterclass session with Peter Qvortrup, the main guy from Audio Note, who's, he's the real deal in the business. So let's just listen what he has to say.
So it's quite a, I know your answer for that. Mazban is asking, yeah. So the question is, which is better, solid state or waltz? I know your answer for that.
Really quite a good question here from Abhishek. It says here, depends on matches your speaker setup, transistor, MOSFETs, or valve-based. Every amp and speaker has different characteristics. Well, that's exactly the problem I described when I started, and that is the mix and match approach. What we do is we design the speakers to work with our amplifiers.
Yeah.
We design the amplifier to do the same with the speaker.
Yep,
We do the same with the preamplifier versus the amplifier. So we look at, we call them gates.
And I just want to say that you can have the best equipment in the world, an Audio Note speaker, and then you can put it on a lot of gear that's pretty good, let's just say transistor gear or some of the other tube brands out there, and you won't ever hear anything that comes near to the full potential of that Audio Note speaker, because that Audio Note speaker is made for Audio Note gear. I mean, a lot of manufacturers would like to tell you that, oh, they sell a neutral gear, so their speaker is going to work great with all of the brands out there, or most of the brands out there, but it's a lie. Every single speaker, as an example, speaker is kind of, it goes in a certain direction, it does a certain thing, and even if you have pretty good transistor gear, it usually doesn't sound very good with Audio Note speakers. And that's even though Audio Note make basically the best speakers in the world. And it's just to let you guys know that you need the same language. Speaker, amplifier, source material, cables, it all has to be the same. And if you, on top of that, can control it at a level where you have the power supply and other stuff like that, if you have the whole turntable being one brand like Audio Note, instead of having a turntable with one brand pickup, another brand tone arm, another brand turntable, another brand rear before it goes into the amplifier with another brand cable, I mean, you're totally destroying the potential of the sound. So I think that a lot of people like to listen to a lot of stuff that is cool and interesting, and they want that certain type of effect. But trust me, go all in. If you're not taking Audio Note, fine. Go all in on Macintosh or Hegel or YBA or whatever you choose. Just go all in on that philosophy. And yeah, you're probably going to miss out on some deals that would have given you a lot of value, but trust me, in the long run you will actually be saving money, even though in the short run it will seem as if you're losing money. So just keep in there and try to keep everything in the same religion. Then the sound will come to you, and you will, with patience, you will get into that top sound. And this does not only apply to Audio Note. You can also do this with other brands, doing it via this philosophy that I just explained.
That the signal has to, when a signal passes through a circuit or any given part of the system, it has to jump gates. The lower you can make the gate, the more complete the passing of the signal is. And for us, and again, I think it's relatively easy to prove, for us, the fact that that we use transform everywhere is a way of keeping the gate as low as possible. We do not use MOSFETs. We do not use anything else in our top of the range products, we only use 1910 technology, i.e. directly heated triodes in as simple a configuration as possible.
That is
As I
interesting.
said earlier, it is one of the fundamental problems with our technological culture is the complication is looked at as being more clever than simplicity.
Interesting argument.
We have an enormous capacity as a species for making things immensely complicated when they don't need to be. What type of...
So I still didn't get an answer to my question. Which is better, solid states or what?
Solid state is shit. I'm sorry. Solid state is completely unsuitable for music reproduction. Because
So it doesn't depend on what type of music you're listening to. I mean, suppose if you consider the newer age techno and extended deep bass, all synthetic sounds and synths and all that, would solid state be better off in that realm?
Nope. If you sat in my system, and if you ever come to the UK, you're very welcome to come and see the factory, and I'll let you listen to my system at home.
Peter is mostly right. If you're talking about what we currently know as standard configurations, so that you buy CD, streamer, amps, speakers, like normal people buy their stuff, then yes, tube sound at the top level of audio node level, that is of course a lot better. The problem with that argument is that Peter is used to a level 5 audio node system. There won't be many people alive for the next 100 years that will have listened to that. Maybe a couple of thousand years, maybe a couple of thousand people in 100 years that will have listened to an audio node level 5 system. So what he's talking about is a reality on such a high level. Most people don't even know that this exists. I've listened to systems like Peter's, and it is the best that you can buy, but it's also a ridiculous amount of money. And let's just go down to a realistic level of what people can afford. A $50,000 to $100,000 audio node system where you have a speaker, an amplifier, a DAC, cables, CD player, if I didn't mention that before. Then you're within like the realm of reality, what is possible for normal people if they just use a lot of time and for them a lot of money. That is still a lot of money. That could still, when you set that up in a proper way, not in these normal audio node stores or at audio node hi-fi shows, if you set that up in a proper way, it could still beat any top brand out there. Macintosh, Classic, Krill, Past Labs, whatever you want to call a top brand. It could still beat that if you set that up in a proper way. But the problem is, truth is very relative to all the missing factors that haven't been covered. So most people won't listen to systems that are 50 to 100% of their full potential. Most people are listening to systems in the 5 to 20% of their full potential on that scale. Most things that you listen to at a hi-fi show, 10 to 20, maybe 25% of its full potential. So that kind of makes this whole argument from both sides a bit irrelevant, because it's more a question of reaching the full potential of the system that you have, whether it being audio notes, spectral, let's take a random brand, Hegel, exposure. It's all about doing that, and just comparing that to what I said before. When you follow this philosophy that audio note does, where everything is controlled at a very small level, gaining full access to the speaker so it can fully integrate with the amplifier, the CD, the DAC, everything else. When you're controlling all aspects, then yeah, your audio note system will most likely run at a higher potential of its full potential, because everything is kind of the same language, compared to a random system of, for example, M-Labs CD player, Macintosh amplifier, a DAC from Meitner, a speaker from B&W. It most likely will then run better on that audio note system, and you most likely will be able to run that audio note system at a better sound level compared to the amount of money that you've put into the system. Okay, but it also requires that the person buying this gear is kind of what can you say, is on a mission where he knows where he's going. And a lot of people in the audio world, they don't know where they're going. They're kind of trying this and trying that, and they are judging the equipment based on the interaction with other brands, and you cannot fully get the full expression of the sound doing that. You have to almost know from the start where you want to go and do that 110%. Then once you've done that 110%, then you've got the full sound of what that company intended for that to sound like. So Peter is right, but the problem is that he's referring to his audio notes system, which is the best in the world. There's no arguing that, but we're also talking about a system that probably costs $2 million if someone would buy that in a store. So that $2 million sound system that he has, yeah, it will beat a $5-10 million system at any hi-fi show, without a doubt. But arriving at that point is more difficult. And I have to say that I don't like to argue against Peter Qvortrup, but there are some few transistor brands, less than a handful, that are really good. Spectral, Negra, D'Agostino, Griffin, YBA, for example, Top YBA. Those are brands where they are way above the average of the transistor. So the transistor standard. So it's not fair to say that there's like transistor and then tube audio. I mean, the guy also has to sell his own brand. He can't talk bad about his own company. No one will ever do that. So I have to be the objective one and look at this from a neutral standpoint. Yes, once you get into that top category of transistor brands, it gets pretty close to audio note, especially when it's set up just perfectly. But you just have to know that amount of time figuring those combinations out, combined with the amount of money that you need to get to something that's close to audio notes, mid-level, that will definitely cost you a lot, finding that combination. And I only know one person. That's the guy who developed my not developed my streamer, but who's developing his the streamer company that I've been raving about on my channel. That's the only guy that I know that can make crap equipment sound close to, or maybe even sometimes better than audio notes gear. But he's the only guy who knows how to do that. So technically he is right. Peter is kind of right, but you just have to know how he's right.
When you hear my system at home, you will understand why I say this.
Yeah.
There is nothing
It is
that
crazy,
solid
that
state
system.
has to offer
Ah,
that has any validity
ah,
in music reproduction.
well,
The only possible exception to that would be if you want to make a really, really cheap amplifier, then you would need to use solid state, so that the price versus quality balance is balanced towards price, not quality. There is absolutely no current or past transistor amplifier that can compete with a decent single-ended amplifier.
that statement is a bit out there. When we're talking about top equipment, yeah, audio note takes the cake without a doubt. When we're talking about, if we are talking about the lowest end audio note gear, then I would say that I would still prefer a lot of the best transistor gear out there. Negra, Spectral, even though it costs like 5 to 10 times more, I would still prefer that. But here's also a big caveat to that. The big problem with this discussion is that there are a lot of really interesting and good speakers out there that aren't audio notes. I would say at least 20, maybe even 30 speakers out there in the world that aren't audio note. And it's going to be difficult running that on audio note gear. Or running audio note gear on those speakers, because those speakers are typically only around 90 dB. And even if you get up to these 93, 94, 95 dB speakers that are pretty efficient, they're just not really built for the audio note sound, a lot of them. Some sound really awesome with audio note. But that is the big reason for not having audio note, and why you would take a really good transistor brand. And I'm talking about those about 5 brands that I mentioned: Spectral, Negra, YBA, Griffin, D'Agostino, those type of brands. There you actually have something contending with audio note, and I would say actually beating audio note at when you take the lowest audio note models into consideration. But is that a fair comparison? I wouldn't say, because we're also talking about a completely different price class. Okay, so as soon as you get up to like mid-level audio note gear, mid-level audio note gear still beats Spectral and Negra and all of these top transistor brands. It still beats it, and it doesn't beat it by like a 1% or 2%. It's like 20% better, and we're not talking about anything that's close to being the most expensive audio note gear. So it everything's relative. It depends on how you measure it, the conditions, and yeah, I mean, the best audio note gear is the best gear ever in the world, and will probably be the best gear forever for probably several hundreds of years. Even if audio note goes bankrupt in 20, 30, 50, 100 years, it will still probably have been the best ever music equipment in the world, looking from the bottom to the mid end to the high end gear. The consistency is just crazy. Even with the lower end gear, they still have silver terminals on the back. And even with the lower speakers that they sell, they still have silver terminals. And those aren't just silver terminals. Those are basically the best silver terminals in the world. And it just goes to show you that the amount of detail and consistency that audio note go through in order to preserve that quality is crazy. No one builds low and medium models at the same high quality that audio note does. No one does. I mean, I have an audio note Otto mid mid model version. That's far from the top of audio note, but still that makes me happy and satisfied, because it's just all the way through top quality. And I can constantly keep on making that better. I can put better cable on, I can put better cable on my DAC, and it just constantly responds and goes on to another level. And with this other gear, you have a sort of a limited reach where you have to keep the sound within a certain zone and use a certain combination of certain brands doing a certain thing. And then, yes, it does certain things that are awesome, really awesome, but it also takes other stuff away that just, in the end, you just feel like you've lost that bit of extra you could have had from audio note at a much lower price. So it's all relative, you know. And it's what I really wanted to say was this: there are some really good speakers that aren't audio note that you want to use, and you've heard them, I've heard them, other people have heard them in the world, and you just can't put a 8-10 watt audio note amplifier on them. I mean, they're basically gonna make any sound because it's just not powerful enough, and that is a huge problem. So a lot of potentially good speakers just can't use the best amplifiers in the world, and it's a sad truth about the whole audio arena. So Peter is in a way right, but I just wanted to give you guys the full truth.
With a single end, with a directly heated triode. The only problem with that is that you don't get a lot of power, so you need relatively efficient speakers.
Yeah, like I said.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I'm still divided on that front, and especially since I come from more of the pro side of things, where we do like large format sound systems. I mean, WAVs just don't stand a chance there, and obviously that's because they are so low powered, and we really need much higher powers.
All you do, well, I mean, firstly, if we've supplied a few systems to studios here in the UK, and one in Paris, and one of the things that the recording engineers realized when they used our systems with our speakers and cables was that in order to hear what they felt they needed to hear, they didn't have to play as loud as they did on a transistorized system with very inefficient speakers. So I think what the problem you have as a recording engineer is that in order to raise the sort of the level of detail, if you can call it that, you need to play quite loud on a system with PMC speakers and whatever the amplifiers are in order to drive them.
PMs
You
are
don't
pretty
need
horrible.
to do that if you use a 9-watt amplifier with a pair of our speakers that are 98 dB efficient. You will be able to hear what you need to hear at a much, much lower level because the sound is less contaminated.
Yeah, that is kind of true.
Mazban, you
But again, how many 98 dB speakers are there out there, or 98 plus dB speakers? There aren't, you know. I mean, music really starts to take off around 95 dB when you're talking about speak. I'm generalizing, you know, but that's what I've encountered, having listened to a lot of speakers throughout the years. Around 95 dB plus, that's where music really starts to take off and become, you know, foot-tappingly addicting, and you're just singing there, swinging, listening to all types of music, and you know, got this life and energy, and it's just, you know, just like rushing over you like a wave. That's what it takes, you know, to create life and energy. You know, you need a pretty efficient speaker, and the problem with a lot of these really good speakers around 90 dB is that they're boring. They require a lot of power, and in order to deliver power, you usually have to take away quite a bit of the quality of the signature to deliver that power, because it requires a huge amount of force, and when you have a huge amount of force, it's almost impossible to maintain the highest level of quality signature that the sound has to offer.
You also have another question, I believe, which you have asked about the frequency, the sampling, 96 kilohertz.
Yeah, Peter. So you were talking about 16 kilohertz as being the perfect balance between bandwidth and
16-bit 44 kilohertz.
Yeah, 16-bit 44, which is this Red Book standard. But what I want to say is that today most studios offer 96 kilohertz recording capabilities as the go-to standard or the gold standard, and they say that, you know, there's a lot of air, and you hear a lot of air, and it, you know, really it's especially more important in the higher frequencies that you can make out the difference of 96 kilohertz versus 16.
Again, I'll refer to what I said earlier, that you know, I mean, when I go to studios, I have to say that I am appalled at how bad the sound is. I am absolutely astounded that you guys can even hear what it is you're trying to do. And so from that perspective, you get my applause, because I sure as shit can't hear at the levels that people work at in studios. I can't hear whether one thing is better than the other. It is, one, they play far too loud, and two, the sound is so contaminated in most cases that it's very difficult to hear. I did a recording session with my conductor friend is called Peter Qvortrup. He's a Greek Russian. And last year I attended a series of recordings we did, but there's one in particular where I spent quite a lot of time. And that was a recording of Beethoven's 7, done at the Concerthaus in Vienna, with Theodor's own orchestra, which is called Musica Eterna. And there we managed to get a tape recorder to record simultaneously with the digital system, which is a 96 kilohertz system. And then we had some issues with the orchestra had been standing up for something like 8 hours. These Russians are tough, I tell you. For the violins and everyone to stand up for 8 hours while we were
That
recording
is
is
tough.
just extraordinary. Anyway, they insisted on a break.
I can understand that. I remember people at work telling me about an event that happened that I wasn't at, where they were forced to take off their shoes and stand on a concrete floor for, I think it was 3 hours, and one of the participants actually fainted, so they had to call on some medical assistance. So it doesn't sound like it's tough, but trust me, it's tough standing up for 8 hours and then also playing an instrument. That's crazy.
So I went up to the monitoring room, and we did some listening to the scherzo of the third movement of the I think it's the third movement of the seventh. And then I said to the producer, "Can we hear the what we recorded on the tape recorder, just for comparison?" I swear to God, the first 2 seconds, in fact, the first 2 beats of the tape sounded so much better than this 96 kilohertz trash that we had listened to before. Yeah. That the producer, who is a very famous and highly regarded Italian chap, he looked at me and he said, "Are you sure that the replay we got from the digital is not that there's not something wrong with it?" And I said to him, "No, this is what it sounds like." He had never in his entire career, over the 25 years that he'd been doing this, sat down and done a direct comparison between tape and digital. And this exactly proves my earlier point. History, history, history. If you do not know where you're coming from, you do not know where you're going.
That is interesting.
There's a famous joke in English where you stop somebody on the street and you say to them, "Can you tell me the road to Lincoln?" And they look at you and they go, "Well, if you want to go to Lincoln, you wouldn't want to start from here." Do the comparisons yourself, but you have to do it in systems that are complementary to the quality of tape. Because if you don't do that, all you're doing is doubling up on the mistake.
Yeah, that's true.
It's really simple.
Simple, I wouldn't say, but yeah.
I rest my case, as it were.
Peter, there's a question from Russell. Russell, can I request you to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? Maybe it will be better if you can ask the question directly to Peter. Russell, if you can unmute yourself.
Well, what Russell is saying is that that altering that happens, that you can see on measurements, is a function of the way the measurements work, not the way the amplifier works. It's very simple. I think we got a break up now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. You know, this is a classic standard engineering complaint. Valve amplifiers have too much distortion.
Yeah, I heard that a lot.
Okay, so let's set the levels and take a transistor amplifier with low distortion, measured distortion, and a valve amplifier. And we turn the volume up to a certain level so that the dB levels are the same. And then you make a judgment which one has the more distortion. And I can absolutely guarantee you that if you take one of my amplifiers and compare it to anything else in the transistor realm, you will hear more distortion from the transistor amplifier. So the question then is, what is it we're measuring if it doesn't express itself sonically? And the answer to that is that as Einstein said when he was asked why we measure certain things, he said that, well, we measure what we know how to measure. We don't necessarily measure what is important, but we measure what we know how to measure.
No.
And any judgment based on measurements alone is utterly worthless. You know.
So the famous statement of Einstein is that not all things that count can be counted, and not all things that.
Exactly. I mean, but that is the problem that we've ended up with a sort of a technological cultural preference, or whatever you want to call it, that we think we can measure everything. I mean, nowhere is this more prevalent in mathematical economics.
Yep.
You know, it is so far removed from the empirical function of markets.
I just want to add to that. I also find that every time I go and look at a newer amplifier that has more watts, fine, it has more watts, but what does that mean? Does that mean that it's more powerful, that it has better grip, that it has better signature? For me, that usually indicates that it has better perceived grip, better perceived power, but that it comes at the expense of the signature, because it just sounds more suppressed. The thing about power is you want to keep the watts, you don't want to use too many watts at the expense of the quality. You want to keep the watts as pure as possible, so that the first watts hitting the speakers is the highest quality watt that exists. And the problem is that once you start using transformers that are made from the most basic metal, with the most basic shielding and the most basic plastic, and it's wrapped around and there's asphalt and all kinds of things interacting with it, you basically just have a jolt of energy. You don't have any signature that really travels through that piece of wire, this wire that's wound up and becomes a transformer. And I hear this constantly when I look at these videos on YouTube, and they're saying, wow, 1000 watt, 2000 watt, all this stuff. It's basically just a way of giving a jolt to the music, so it seems as if it's powerful, but it makes the music also more flat and non-caring and non-reactive, and kind of standing out in a certain way, highlighting certain things. And so yeah, can we really use measurements? And mostly in audio specific, we still have problems using measurements, so they actually indicate that there still is quality combined with that technical improvement. So it's definitely interesting. It makes you kind of wonder how everything works in audio.
But it is still used as the main way of judging how economies work.
Yep.
You create mathematical models for everything. The Black-Scholes equation.
In 1882, a man called Bury wrote a book called Flatland, and the subtitle is a love affair in 2 dimensions. That eminently describes our technological preferences in audio, at least the measurement ones. I mean, you can't measure the difference between 2 resistors but you can sure as shit hear them. You know, so if you can hear those differences, I mean, I can demonstrate something to you with, we make a turntable with 3 motors. With that turntable, we have 4 different power supplies. And so power supply 1, if you use conventional measurements, it measures exactly right. Power supply 2, use the same measurements, it measures the same way. 3 the same way, 4 the same way. When you move from 1 to 2, the sound from the turntable is clearly better. When you move from 2 to 3, there's a massive jump in performance of the turntable. These are the same motors going at the same speed with running a belt on the outside of the platter. We can't measure these differences, but I can tell you, I have yet to meet somebody who cannot hear those differences.
That is an interesting argument.
Even somebody with a hearing aid, I know, could hear the difference.
I also find that very interesting that Audionaut are the only ones who are focusing on this multi-motor design, outer motor design. So instead of just having one powerful motor, you have 2, 3, or maybe even more motors driving the whole turntable. And I can tell you guys that it makes a huge difference in regards to giving a lot more bites and just making the sound a lot more exciting and inviting and just like really going constantly, making you interested. What I find is that with a lot of turntables, that they just feel so old and limited and safe in sound, and it's nice having a VPI turntable, a top VPI turntable, but again it's kind of boring, you know, and it takes something away from the sound, so that entire rush and the feel of adventure just really isn't there. And there is something about that simple way that Audionaut does it, where they have a low platter, several engines, and they have a simple arm, and it's a short arm, and they have these pickup needles that are actually quite simple, but it's how they do it. It's that simple integration and consistency where less is actually more when you're able to do it at the Audionaut level. And try and look into one of these power supplies from Audionaut. I mean, those are insanely good power supplies. When you look at other companies' power supplies at the same price, you just kind of go like, what? I mean, it just feels like this 50 years of development in difference quality-wise, you know. A lot of these power supplies for these basic turntables, I mean, they feel like they've got some kind of a adapter thing from eBay costing like $5 or $10, where when you look at an Audionaut motor, basically the motor is the reason for why the whole turntable system sounds so good. And also because Audionaut, they have, with, for example, their Otto and their Maishu amplifiers, they have the phono section integrated, and it perfectly matches the pickups. So if you own an Audionaut RIA, which is an LP amplifier, I mean, it's already in the amplifier on many of them. That's why they call phono. So you don't need an extra box or an extra cable or anything. So less negotiation, simple, well, what's it called? Less is more. That's what I'm trying to say.
And that's that's an extra set of amplifiers in between, and he still heard the difference. So there's so much we don't know. But you know, it's I don't know whether you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger curve or the Dunning-Kruger effect. And really where the audio industry finds itself is that all the engineers are a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. They think they know a lot, but they know very little.
Yep.
So there you are. Welcome to the real world. I think we're running out of time now.
Yeah, we are almost towards the end of the session. Any further questions from anyone? In fact, there's an observation from Russell which says that a good example of what you're saying is the difference between an amp with an SMPS and one with a linear power supply.
Sorry, I'm trying to read some of the questions. What are my thoughts? I have field coil speakers. Let me finish with that. We are currently developing field coil speakers. This is a project that has sort of been, it's a bit of a stepchild project in a way, that it's sort of been come in and taken off and come in and taken off the agenda. I have the first prototypes at home. And I mean, I knew because I've been playing with field coils in the late 70s and the early 80s. So I had a pretty good idea what the difference was. But to be honest with you, to be reminded 40 years later how superior a field coil is when it's done properly, because we can do a direct comparison. We had the same drive unit with a ferrite magnet. We had the same drive unit with an Alnico, very high quality Alnico 5 magnet. And then we have a field coil. And it's in the same speaker, so we can do a direct comparison. We're not comparing an apple to an orange. We are comparing apples, or oranges, or pineapples, or whatever the hell you want to call it. The superiority of the field coil is such, I mean, it's eye-watering how much better it is. It really is.
This surprises me a bit because I haven't heard field coil. I've heard Western Electric that he claims is field coil. And yeah, they did some things that were quite impressive, but overall, I would say the audio note speakers are a lot better. So this is a bit of a surprise for me because audio note speakers are the best speakers I've heard overall. If this is really true that he's found something that's even better than the current lineup, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to hear that within the next couple of years. That sounds like something that could take like 10 or 20 years to fully develop, because what he's talking about is, it's one of the few things that I haven't experienced that. So I'm really looking forward to that, if that's supposed to be a lot better. Because I've heard some of the beta equipment from AudioNote that didn't really make it on the market, and it was some really good stuff, and pity they couldn't release it on the market, but it had some problems, I think some stability problems, and I think in the end they actually fixed a lot of those things. But I feel that this is a project that, with like a lot of the other ambitious projects from Peter, that he's probably going to run into a lot of resistance. Because I also heard him before working on an audio note speaker with a 10-inch drive instead of an 8, and they had problems fully integrating that. So I think this is like, to come probably 5 or 10 years in the future if we're lucky, and maybe also at that time they'll be able to fully integrate their R2R ladder DACs into their top line Fifth Element audio note DAC, which is the best DAC in the world. But yeah, there are limitations for what you can do, and right now how things are with the top level of audio note sound, it doesn't feel to me like it can at all get any better, because it just feels ludicrously good. I mean, so good that it almost paralyzes you to the degree that you can't stop listening once you've turned that on for at least 2, 4, 5 hours before you then, naturally have to go to bed because you have to go to work and stuff like that. But that he's talking about something that's a lot better than what we have right now it's kind of strange. I haven't experienced that, but I would like to hear that. That would be really interesting.
We're putting a major research effort now into looking at materials to see how far we can push that. We got silver wire coming in to wind the coil that generates the field with silver wire, to see whether there's any difference between using copper wire or silver wire, or whether there's a difference between using copper-plated aluminium wire, copper wire, and silver wire. This is how we work. We do very, very, very careful comparisons between materials, methods, processes, and so on, in order to be able to build a picture of where is the top of the curve. And the top of the curve can end up being very expensive, which is how we end up with some of these ludicrously expensive products we make. Okay. But to my great surprise, there are actually customers out there for $200,000 DA converters. Or $200,000 preamps, line preamps. So, what would you know? But thanks for that question. I'd completely forgotten that. That's quite an important part of the...
Are there any other developments that you would like to speak about in terms of what's going to come out of audio?
We're in the process of developing or finalizing development on belt drive CD transports. Okay. We've discovered some things. The belt drive, the best of the versions we have, reduces the interference by the error correction circuit by about 25 times. Okay. So instead of having the motor doing all sorts of things and the error correction circuit sitting there doing this, the error correction circuit is doing hardly anything, and the motor is doing its job. We've improved the power supplies on the laser enormously. We're running belt drive on the laser as well, instead of mechanical drive, a direct mechanical drive. We've got much better motor supplies, so the motors are not cocking like shit,
okay,
etc., etc. I mean, there are a number of refinements there which we're still in the process of finalizing. We've got a discrete DAC coming out. It's not a ladder. It's a matrix, an MASC, and again we are finding that a lot of the theory that we read, the more modern theory that we read, is wrong. Yes, it measures better, and yes, it's faster, and yes, it's all this, but it doesn't actually work sonically. And I think one important thing to mention, certainly worth mentioning, which of course also is in terms of technological ideology, very difficult to swallow for most engineers, is that what we find very interesting is that the earliest technologies that are used in audio, i.e. the directly heated triode 1911, the Forest, The very first loudspeakers, field coils. The very earliest digital to analog converter were discrete resistor networks of one form or another. You can take, turntables, the very early suspended turntables are still the best. You can then add more motors and so on, but that doesn't change the fundamentals of the design. That's just embellishing it and making it better, but still using the original idea.
I think there's some. I just thought about something. I think the problem with many of these big platter turntables is that when you have a big platter and you have only one engine and you have a huge arm, the huge arm creates a lot of error, this long arm. The platter has a way of suppressing noise that kind of destroys life, energy, and human qualities. And I just realize now that I think that's one of the main reasons why the audio note turntable way of displaying the sound is so good, because it just is so simple that it reacts in a more direct way, giving you more feedback instead of trying to suppress and error correct like many of these more expensive and modern turntable inventions. So I had that realization. So that's quite interesting.
And so what's so interesting to me is that why is it that the very earliest versions of quality always, when properly applied, sound better than the later solutions? And it can only be because as we develop things, we develop them to cut cost. When you cut cost, you cut quality. I can send you the most famous quote on this, which was by a man called John Ruskin in 1860, where he talks about this, and I'll copy and paste it and send it to you. You can publicize it somewhere. And it really perfectly describes where we are now.
Yeah, I guess so. Price-wise.
Yeah.
Has to make sense.
As early as 1860. Wow.
Pardon?
As early as 1860, someone is.
Ruskin was a sort of industrialist philosopher. He subscribed to the Robert Owen ideas of how you treated your workforce, for example.
Okay.
There's some very famous. It's almost like a town outside in Lanark in Scotland, where he tested a lot of his ideas. He's quite an important. He's largely forgotten now, because of course you don't want to treat your workers very well, because that's not good for profit, at least not for short-term profit, or so they say. Both Owen and Ruskin proved that it's not true.
Okay. There's one question which I think we should know. What are the importance of cables according to you?
Thanks, Arnaud. Arnaud took everyone. There's hardly anything in the world that someone cannot make a little worse and sell a little cheaper. And the people who consider price alone is that person's lawful prey. And then you can read the rest for yourself.
So Masban is asking about the importance of cables.
Well, there's a question about the name of this record. I mean, all you need to do, if you can see the record, you see it? It's called Dimensions in Sound. And it's a conductor. He's actually a band leader because he was mainly a jazz band leader. This guy called Bob Sharples.
Okay.
It regularly turns up on eBay. I bought every copy that's turned up on eBay the last 2 years.
Okay.
I have a virtual monopoly.
I should see his record collection,
valves.
Peter Qvortrup.
Peter, there's a question by Mazban which basically asks about the relevance of cables and how important are cables in the entire sound reproduction system. And the follow-up question is, does one need $100,000 cables to get better sound?
Well, I mean, if you spend $100,000 on my cables, you will get better sound. I'm not so sure about anything else. I mean, cables are very, very complex. As with most of the audio chain, the cables are part of a transmission line that starts at the stylus or the CD transport and that ends at the speakers. And unless the cable is able to not act as a high gate to the signal, and most cables do. Most cables are appalling. They really are. I regularly get customers come to me with super expensive, especially speaker cables, and I test them at home. And I mean, the degradation they cause is worse than a lot of active components.
I also have to say that we're talking about Peter Qvortrup and his system, which has audio note silver on every single link. So yeah, I mean, almost every cable in the world, if you connected that to his system, it would immediately show how trashy that cable was. So I wouldn't say that's a fair comparison. There are some few cables that are not audio note that actually deliver quite a bit of value. But yeah, in terms of the overall sound, naturality, really connecting on a human and spiritual level, you can't really get past the fact that audio note does something very different with their cables, because first of all, it's the best quality crystal that they use, crystal thread, which is either copper or silver. They use the highest quality plastic insulation, which is soft and doesn't strangle the threads, meaning that it doesn't suppress the sound or in some way bias the sound in certain frequencies. They don't use these cheap metal, what do you call it, shields that really shut the sound in and only improve the hi-fi technical parts of the sound. So I think that's one of the main reasons why they are so good. Plus they also have the Litz copper that they use. I think that they're almost the only ones using that. And then they've got some kind of a lacquer treatment on it, which also makes quite a big of a difference. Plus the fact that when you combine these with audio note plugs, that combination really it just makes it unique, because once you then have that cable and connect it with the same type of cable in an amplifier and a speaker, it just, like he said, it reduces that gate, so you don't get the effect on top of the effect on top of the effect. It just feels like it's one sound traveling unimpeded from the amplifier and directly over to the speaker, or you could say like the source, the CD player to the DAC to the amplifier to the speaker. It just feels like it's one thing that goes in a certain high quality way, uninterrupted all the way through, and that is just the fact, the consistency Audio Note makes things so simple that no one can really copy what they're doing. Even when you look at Audio Note Kit, this other company copying Audio Note, you can see that they don't use the same quality cable, same quality soldering tin, same quality boards. They don't use nearly as good as transformers, capacitors, resistors. It's like not even close, but that is what it takes in order to make cables good. They have to be in one way extremely simply made but also extremely high quality, and getting that high quality crystal metal, which is either copper or silver typically, you won't find anything close to the Audio Note silver sound. Even really good cables like Nordøst, Valhalla, Nordøst, Odin, they're probably 60% as good as the Audio Note sound, but that last 40% that that glues everything together, makes it human, integrates fully, has perfect balance, and doesn't just go off in this like insane hi-fi direction with crazy energy and big powerful bass and stuff like that, and then highs going endlessly high up. It brings it all together when you have less things going on in a cable, and I think that Audio Note really nailed that. So I also have to say that I've listened to a lot of Audio Note equipment that didn't quite catch my attention, because a lot of the customers of Audio Note don't really use enough time on getting the plugs and the cables right. That is such a big mistake to make when you have such a high quality level of gear that Audio Note delivers. If you have medium to high class Audio Note gear, you deserve to use a couple of $1,000 on cables, making sure that it matches what's inside of your speaker and what's inside of your amplifier, so it's the same type of things. And don't try and do it yourself. Don't try and put some eBay plugs on. It needs to be done at an Audio Note dealer, or just buying it directly from Audio Note. The dealer needs to use Audio Note's silver tin, Audio Note original cables, original plugs. Do not buy this off eBay and expect a sound that's anywhere close to the Audio Note sound. Once you've completed all the chains and you have the same religion on every part of the chain, it doesn't matter if you have low or medium quality Audio Note gear. If you don't have the highest level of Audio Note gear, it will still satisfy you. It will still get you to that top level. So my advice is that don't look on all these used markets and try MIT cables, VDH cables, QED cables, all of these cables, the lower quality Cardes and AudioQuest cables. I mean, AudioQuest and Cardes, they make cables that are a lot better than the standard, but you have to at least then use their mid to top models. Don't use their bottom models. The bottom models suck like most other cables do in the business. You should completely stay away from hi-fi cables at the bottom level of each brand. That's my personal advice. If you want to pursue hi-fi cables, then do it when you have some decent equipment. But then when you do it, don't go all in, but just be reasonable and say, I want something that matches what's inside my amp, my DAC, my CD player, my speaker. It all has to be the same religion. And then fine, go on with that. If you have a medium level Audio Note piece of gear, you can still get a relatively cheap cable, and make sure that you just repeat that. And repeat that on the speaker part, and maybe repeat that on the power cables and the signal cables. You might want to up that up one class, because you're really going to feel that a lot on the signal part if you could like go with the silver cable. But try and do it that way. That's the smart way of doing things, and that's one way where it's an illusion of you using more money. Oh, how are you going to sell this equipment? So and so and so. What's it then going to be worth, and whatever. Once you do this right, it sets you on a path where you say you're not interested in what's really going on in the audio market. You feel like you have everything, and you can just come home, you can relax, and you don't have to overthink stuff and try a new cable, try a new amplifier and stuff like that. I'm telling you guys, if you could just have an Audio Note ELX speaker and a basic Audio Note Maestro amplifier that is 10 years old used with a phono stage, and just have an Audio Note 2.1 signature LP player, you would be so happy that you wouldn't even consider anything else for the rest of your life. Even when we're talking 5, 15, 25 years in the future, you wouldn't be going like, oh, I wish I had this and that. It just sounds so musically evolved. And yeah, it can get a hell of a lot better from Audio Note going up to like a top Maestro model. I mean, it gets a lot more clear, a lot more evolved. Everything's better. And then you can go up from there to Tonmeister Maestro Silver Signature Phono. And again, it gets like 3 times better. And then again, if you want to, you can go up to the Ongaku, which a lot of people think is slightly better. Or you can take like a double Ongaku integrated, and then you can put like the best preamplifier in the world, M10 preamplifier from Audio Note. And you would again have an effect that is probably 3 times better. But just realize that just because you maybe are settling with a slightly lower model of Audio Note, that doesn't mean that you won't be satisfied. But it would, with most other brands, mean that you most likely won't be satisfied for a long period of time.
And that's hard to believe that that's even possible. How do you make something that's technically passive have losses of that magnitude? And you have to do a pretty shitty job, to be perfectly honest. But there you are. No, but to answer the question, no, you don't. You need cables that are dimensioned to suit the particular behavior of your system. And I mean, I can only really speak for what we do, and that is we make a wide range of cables precisely for that reason. That if you buy one of our cheaper systems, you just use one of the cheaper cables, and this is why we have a level system where we place the cables and the amplifiers and the speakers and so on within levels to make that easier for the customer, so that the customer can walk into the dealer with some understanding of what the recommendations are. And it's relatively simple. I mean, it's not really rocket science.
Are there any further questions from anyone else? Because we are running short of time, and in fact we have exceeded the time limits. But I'm open for 1 or 2 last questions if there are any.
Actually, just follow up to my question on cables. Peter, the reason for me asking about this is because many times in many shows and stuff we see people make really fancy claims that these cables are cold rolled and these things are molecules are aligned to the magnetic north, or all that kind of stuff. And all this, is this all bullshit marketing stunt, or does it really affect cables? I mean, because finally the cables are only a link from outside your speaker to outside your amplifier. What happens inside your amplifier? You're just using normal electrical wire to connect maybe the speaker terminals to the output of the valves, and probably normal electrical wire to connect the speaker terminals to the inside of the crossover. So how much of a difference is your bloody, $1 million cables going to make when you've got electrical wire connecting your speakers to your connectors?
Well, I mean, again, I can only speak for what we do. I mean, I know from like I said earlier, from playing around with some very famous both interconnects and speaker cables, that there are clearly losses in cables that are very difficult to explain when you, for example, measure them. And again, I think that tells us more about the deficiencies in our measuring systems than it tells us anything about the cables. I think the problem is that it's very easy to go, there's this, one of the fashionable things at the moment is to do this where you freeze everything down and to almost zero, absolute zero. And then that's supposed to do wonderful things to the crystalline structure in the cables. It probably does. I think it sounds, we've tried to do it with our cables, and I think it certainly makes the cable sound slightly different.
I just want to elaborate on this. I agree. When you cryogenically freeze cables, it does something to the sound. But what I find is that in general, what it does is it makes the sound more stands out more, seems more analytical, and somehow like there's more information there. But at the same time, it also makes it more unnatural, a bit sterile. So yeah, really good example of that. What was that now? The old Shunyata, what was it called? Diamondback, something like that. Diamond something. Made a pretty cheap cable, and it actually sounded not so bad for the amount of money that they wanted. I think they only wanted like $300, $400, $500 for that. That was a pretty good cable for the price. And the problem I have with cryo freezing cables is that it just doesn't quite sound natural and fully integrated and balanced. It's kind of off in a way, but it does give you some pretty cool detail. It does do some pretty interesting stuff. So yeah, does it do a difference? Without a doubt, it does a difference. It does make a difference. You can also make a big difference on cables by just taking any cable and it just overloading it, so you break it in, and that also does a difference on cables, so that they usually become more loose and soft and not so well timed in sound. So cables do make a big difference. They can make a big difference. But again, when we're talking about cables that are good, make a big difference, we're also talking about a reality where you have a decent system. And when I'm talking decent, I don't know, we could be saying something like minimum a Hegel amplifier, or a medium to top class Macintosh amplifier, or a low model of audio note. Then we're talking differences that can be heard, but still react very different depending on what brand that you have.
But I don't think it makes them better. I think it just makes them different.
Different, yeah.
And I'm not sure that a process that doesn't actually advance the quality is worth considering.
Yeah.
I think, I've just lent, I don't know whether you know who My Bloody Valentine is, but we were contacted recently by Kevin, who is My Bloody Valentine. And he wanted to try some cables, because he's building a new studio somewhere. So I've sent him some bits of cable, and I haven't heard back because I think partly because of COVID. But I know from playing with our cables in studios, for example, microphone between microphones, that there are massive improvements to be had.
And then we're also talking about a reality where we're talking about basic $1, $5, $10 eBay cables compared to audio note cables that cost a couple of $1,000. So I also would expect a big difference. But again, on microphones, I can imagine, I haven't done this test myself, but I can imagine when you're so close to the source of the signal that it will do a huge difference. That's my experience.
Using a decent silver cable for microphones. That there is no good explanation why that may be. I mean, they don't measure that different from the copper cables that are normally used. But there is a very, very clear difference when you listen to a recording. Same microphone, same position. All you do is change the cable. You play the same piece of music twice, or the musician plays the same piece of music twice. You record it with the normal cable and with a silver cable.
Yeah, of course. There can be a very big difference. And if you would put a normal cheap silver cable on it, usually it would be more airy, bigger soundstage, more raw, and stuff like that. 1 second. And I'll be right there. So when you get over to the audio note silver, we get away from things being artificially bright and big and energetic and flashy. So we get over to a whole other dimension where you also get the good qualities of copper, where it gets earthy, and you get deep into the soundstage, and you get good black levels and stuff like that. So the reason why audio note is silver is so good sound wise is because it just connects on such a deep human natural level that if you think that copper is the best metal in the world in regards to sound, no. Audio note silver is far superior, far more natural, but you have to repeat the silver on a lot of the different parts of the chain. If you only have one silver cable and the rest of it is a different brand or another audio note type of cable, you won't harvest nearly as much.
And there's a very, very obvious difference.
There is a huge difference, huge difference.
If I add one thing, Marsban, I mean, in the audio note amplifiers, the cables we use internally for the speaker wiring, power wiring, for the signal wiring are also made by audio note and are of the same type we use externally. So that is always what amazes me, that it is, consequent throughout actually the audio note components. With each level, you get better internal wiring. That is, you can just see that.
I mean, we are very, very, very thorough compared to anyone else.
They've got about 5 levels of cabling throughout their whole.
We will use, thin cables in places and thick cables in other places in order to balance the voice of a piece of equipment.
Yeah, nobody really does that.
And I mean, if you look at our bills of material, for example, they're incredibly complex. And the people that didn't build the amplifiers are.
But at the same time, they're still very simple. So just so he doesn't contradict himself.
Are following very, 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 I would say in some respects, difficult to follow instructions.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, simple design, simple way of delivering quality, but yeah, a bit more sophisticated on the cable part, how they manage the different thicknesses of cables on different amplifiers and stuff like that. So that's kind of what he wanted to say.
And I think it again, it's like anything else. If you want to build the fastest car or the best this or the best that, you have to look at absolutely every single thing that may have an influence on the behavior.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that Audio Note Copper and Audio Note Silver Sound still integrates, so it functions very well, unlike other brands. That's an important thing to remember. Because usually when other brands try to make their silver with their copper cables work, it usually is very much more separated and different in sound, not fully integrating.
And it doesn't matter whether you're designing a piece of test equipment that's going to go to Mars and measure, how many molecules there are in the atmosphere or whatever, or you're doing what we do. And it's not easy, but it takes a vast amount of dedication, a lot of time, and quite a lot of money to achieve a result that has any permanence.
That is true. I mean, it takes many days, almost weeks, making just one piece of equipment at Audio Note, especially when you reach the mid to top models that Audio Note makes. So it kind of also explains why it's so expensive.
And I'll close on this. My plan has always been, and this sounds very arrogant, and because that's what it is. When I stop doing this and I retire, if I live long enough, that is, then I will have presided over making the best equipment that will ever be made. Ever.
I think he's right.
By anybody.
I think he's right. No other manufacturer will ever say that.
And whether you believe that or not is, of course, a personal matter. But the fact that we, as one of the few high-end manufacturers, have delivery times of in some cases a couple of years on equipment is testament to the fact that there are clearly more people out there that are willing to pay for it and wait.
Yeah. It's a huge waiting list getting Audio Note equipment.
Well said.
Well,
okay. Right, Peter. Thanks a lot.
You have to have a goal, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with you.
You're ambitious.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up the session. Thanks a lot, Peter, for your time.
Well, I mean, just to close, anyone that's got any further questions are welcome to send me a quick email. You may not get a very quick answer, but
and go and visit the Audio Note factory if you can, and listen to Peter's system. I can tell you
that's
quite
great,
a system.
Peter. Thank you. I think that Kartik is disappeared for some reason, but I would really like to thank you for this 1.5 hours of your life, and I really appreciate it. Again, thank you for having people ask questions to either Peter or send a question to me, info@audionote.in. I can forward the question if you like. In any case, thanks. I hope that 2-channel audio is here to stay. There are many developments also which we didn't talk about, which sometimes gives me the idea that it is going to disappear, but that has been said for many years and it's still there. And God bless Peter and Audio Notes for let us enjoying the music as it is intended to be. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Arnold. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.